This video will show you how to construct a square using multiple methods. This is a great way to assess students' understanding of the properties of a square. I've listed the properties over here, and you can use these properties in different ways to actually do your constructions. So I'm going to actually look at this first one. Diagonals are congruent. So that means our diagonals are the same length. They bisect, which means they meet at their midpoint, and they meet at a right angle. So how could we use that understanding to construct a square? So let's get a geometry sticky out, and let's turn off labels for right now because we don't need those. So I just went into settings and I'm turning off auto labeling. And let's just put a segment here. And I want its midpoint, so I'm going to select the segment, go to my tools and construct the midpoint. And I want another segment that's the same length as this to be intersecting this segment, but at a 90-degree angle. How could I do this? I could make a perpendicular and then construct points, but what if I just take my original segment and turn it 90 degrees? So basically create a transformation of my original. And this is going to create a congruent segment turned 90 degrees, so intersecting at that midpoint. So how do I do that? So this is constructing a square using a rotation and this property of diagonal. So I'm going to select my segment and I'm going to go to construct and choose rotation. And I want it to turn about the center, right, because they're bisecting. And now I'm going to tell it, let's move this up here, to turn 90 degrees. And so I'm going to just simply type in my 90 degrees because that gets me my perpendicular. And so now you'll see, and we can kind of move this off here, we've used a rotation of 90 degrees of an original segment. So I know that they are congruent since it's the same segment that's simply been rotated, transformed. And it's 90 degrees, which means they're perpendicular, and it rotated around a midpoint. So I've got this last one here. If I now connect these four vertices, I should have a square. So this is one way to construct a square using the property of the diagonals intersecting, bisecting, being congruent at 90 degrees. So this looks like a square. What could I do to test it? I could absolutely measure the angles. But since I used my property and I know my property is true, if I change this object, it's always going to maintain its squareness because I used a property of a square that's only true for a square. So this is one way to construct a square. Let's go down and use a different way to construct a square, focusing on one of the other properties. So let's move this down so we can see it. So we've used this diagonal. What about this idea of congruent sides? And they have to meet at right angles. Well, what's the only shape that has congruence within it that we know for sure? That's a circle. All the radii of a circle are congruent. So I would get my sides that way. So let's make a circle this time. And again, I'm going to turn off auto labeling. And so we're going to make a circle because the radii of a circle are congruent. And so if I get a segment here and make a segment, I know that that's a radius. And if I make another segment, that's a congruent to that one. But how do I make it be a right angle? Here's where I might want to construct my perpendicular. So let's say I want a perpendicular radius to this one. So I could do a rotation again. I could also use my construction tool. So I'm select it, construct a perpendicular. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. I didn't mean bisector. I want a perpendicular. Construct a perpendicular at the center. So here is my right angle. And so notice I actually have two possibilities. I could have this radius or this. I could make two squares. So let's do the intersections here. Oops. Let's make those intersections. So I'm going to construct my intersections. And so now I don't need this perpendicular line anymore, right? So we're going to hide that object And now I've got two radii. So if I connect this radius to that one, I know it's right angle because it was on that perpendicular. If I do this one, it's on the right angle. Well, let's only construct one of the squares. We don't need them both. And now what could I do? Well, I could do, there's so many ways you could go if you're using these properties. I could do a parallel to this segment. So let's construct a I want to do a parallel to this line through this point. So I'm going to do a parallel. So here's a parallel. And I could do a parallel. So I'm selecting the segment, selecting the point I want it to be parallel through, and I'm constructing a parallel. So I used parallels this time, and let's get the intersection here. So I selected my two lines and doing the intersection. And now the nice thing, let's not hide it yet, but we can now take our polygon tool and follow these vertices and see that we have a square because it has the properties. So we know this is a right angle. We constructed it to be that way through a perpendicular. We know that this is parallel to this and this is parallel to that because we constructed them that way. And all of these things are true, so it must be a square because we followed the properties. And we can test it out by changing the square, changing its size, and we see that it maintains its properties because of our construction. So that's another way to construct a square. There's so many things you could do with this. You could, let's just do one more, but the idea is to use the properties to help you construct. So parallel, we use perpendicular, we use bisecting, all of those different things. Another way to do it might have been, let's pull this up again. Let's leave the points on this time. So we'll make a circle. Let's connect this with a radii. Whoops. And I could do the rotation again. Let's say I don't like to have to hide all those things. So I could construct a rotation around this point at 90 degrees. So very much like our first one. And so now I have a radius here. And then, since I know also a property that we could add in, so let's make this segment here. This is a diagonal, right? And since a square is symmetric everywhere, it does reflect over a diagonal. So I could make a square by simply selecting these points and constructing a reflection over this diagonal, and there is my square. And now maybe I want to hide my circle. So to hide anything, you select it and go to visible and it hides. So notice I now have a square. This is a very different square than the original one. And I'm actually going to hide the images there so we can move our points. But this is a very different square because I did it with rotation and reflection. So students can be really creative, and this is a great way to assess their understanding of the properties.